Jay, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Chris?
Yes, I'm absolutely wonderful. I normally say a bit before I play my intro about the guest that we're going to meet today, but you've got such a colourful, wide ranging, um, happy, and yet at times extremely sad, comprehensive biography that I didn't want to get it wrong. So, Jay, massive welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Yes, I we start again. Our paths crossed on LinkedIn, and
Yeah.
I noticed that you'd written a book called The Falklands Fallen, and we've done a lot of Falklands podcasts.
Mhm.
One thing I'll take away from it all is just a sadness and trauma that just seems to go on for a lot of the veterans and the families and friends concerned.
Yeah.
So that was what piqued my interest. And then when I read your biography, champion bodybuilder, I hate to use the word survivor, it sounds really crappy and American, but an abuse survivor, a life survivor, speaker, obviously author, and I thought, yeah, let's have a chat. One thing I will, final thing I say is our friends at home know I'm climbing Mount Everest in April. And my mission, Jay, is to draw attention to the link between undiagnosed or unhealed childhood trauma, aka complex PTSD, or what later in life becomes complex PTSD, and this alarming rate of suicide we have in the veterans community. No one is talking about those two things.
Yeah.
I would say it's almost the elephant in the room, but it's not even in the room. So anything that we've got to say on that subject, I think, will be of incredible value to anybody,
Yeah.
anybody watching or listening. So yes, over to you. I don't know where. Do you want to start at the beginning?
We can go back to my childhood and the reasons things went in the direction that they did for me. But one thing that I would say in response to what you've just said, and it was one of my attractions to coming on your podcast, I'm in a very fortunate position now in the sense that I'm so whole within myself and I've done so much therapy and work on myself. I very much choose what I do and don't do these days. So I might get asked to do a talk, I might turn it down. I might get asked to go on a podcast and I might think it's just not a good fit. But having seen a couple of your interviews and seeing the way you are as a person, I thought, yeah, I can really have an interesting conversation with this man because he gets so much of it. So let's start with complex PTSD. And for those people who don't understand it, I'm talking with my therapist head now because, along the way I became a qualified therapist, is that complex PTSD tends to occur with people who've had ongoing abuse over a long period of time, usually in situations, most often in situations such as childhood, where they couldn't get away. So there's no escape. So when we look at the way the sympathetic nervous system works, and we've got fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you don't have the option if you're a child who's being abused in your own home to flee. Where are you going to go? And I was born in the 1950s. So back in those days, people didn't interfere. Even if they knew that stuff was going on, people didn't interfere. It's not like these days where you can be 12 and say, I'm going to divorce my parents, because that's become popular. It was a whole different world. So if you're in a childhood situation where you have abuse going on and it's ongoing over a period of years, that is going to be your precursor to getting complex PTSD. Now, that said, I wasn't actually diagnosed with CPTSD until 2019 officially. I remember working for the NHS. I used to be a counsellor at a hospital in palliative care. And I remember doing a PTSD workshop 30 whatever years ago when I first moved to London. And I remember thinking, I tick every single box. Did I do anything about it? No. I knew for years and years and years that I had it. There was just other things that were going on that meant it was important for me in 2019 to actually get an official diagnosis. I did therapy, and I continue to do therapy along the way. But I think we have a society that is rapidly changing. Thank goodness it's rapidly changing now. We are getting to a point where you and I can have this conversation today and talk about some pretty raw things, and elephants in rooms, because, you know, first of all, you have to acknowledge there is an elephant in the room before you can actually do anything about it. But for so many years and for such a long time, and even now, there is still a resistance to when you actually say there's an elephant in the room, somebody's saying, oh yeah, I see it too. And there's been such a stigma for such a long time. It's, I think, rife in the veteran community, because if you start exhibiting symptoms and you start to go and try and get help while you're still serving, you're probably not going to be serving very long. And so often it gets suppressed. It may be coming out sideways in symptom control, like going down the pub and getting slaughtered and all those kind of coping mechanisms that we use, you know, typically. And you're actually, you know, certainly in my husband's day, you were taught to use. Smoke a cigarette, go and get slaughtered, you know. There wasn't the debriefing emotionally, certainly, with any of these situations. It was just get on with the job. And so there is and has been such a massive stigma around having a mental illness, because if it's perceived in that way, instead of, and this is the thing with PTSD, PTSD is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. That's what it is. If you are having things that are traumatic happening to you or around you, it's a normal response to that. It's not normal for you to be in a home as a child where you're not nurtured and people are abusing you. And what's worse than what happened in my situation, they're pretending that they're not. And they're actually not just saying there's no elephant in the room, they're actually making you believe there's something seriously wrong with you, that you even think you can see one. And that's where the archetype of the scapegoat forms. So, yeah, I think we have to get really real about it. If we want to drop the veteran suicide rate and the suicide rate in the population in general, we need to start having these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. I find it's very hard for me to get my head around, because I think with the advent of writing my first memoir, I was just very, you know, obviously if you're writing a book about crystal meth addiction and being down and out in Hong Kong, you've got to be pretty open, honest, graphic and candid. And
Yeah.
And also, Jay, and this must be hard for some people to grasp, but for me, I've just used it as my superpower. Albeit I've gone around the houses and, you know, we're going to come on and talk about bodybuilding. We're going to come on and hopefully talk about addiction. We're going to come on and talk about just kicking the ass out of things and taking it to the extreme, right? I've done all of that. I've had so many near-death experiences. It's you know, and and I feel so fortunate because it's brought me the best life ever, with a family that I'm just so honored to have. And I can, you know, and also it brought me into the light. I can never be a lone wolf, you know, a lone operator again, out there,
Yeah,
lonely, cold, miserable, tired, worried, you know, nervous.
yeah.
That's a past life for me now. And so it, you know, there's a lot that needs to be exposed here, isn't there? You know, how can I say that chronic addiction is the best thing that ever happened to me? Um, and
Well, I think you can say that
yeah,
because actually, you know, it's that thing. I personally haven't done the 12-step program, but I have had a lot of clients historically that were addicts. And so I know a lot about it. And it's that thing, isn't it? How can you possibly start coming back up in any kind of healthy way if you don't hit the floor? You know, they would call it rock bottom, and everybody's rock bottom is different.
yeah. I just want to acknowledge here, Jay, that obviously when someone dies through addiction,
Mm,
that it's tragic, it's awful. However, statistically, despite what we might think from the train spotting movies and stuff, it is, you know, addiction tends to be a phase that many people go through, and statistically, few people actually do die from it. In fact, no one actually dies from it unless it's long term. It's generally an accident, like an overdose, that we tend to lose people. But I just wanted to say that because it sounds a bit gloating, me saying it's the best experience of my life, when I'm well aware. Like, I had a letter last week from a father who lost his son to heroin, and wrote me a very lovely letter to thank me for what I'm doing with the Everest climb. But yes, you just nailed it, Jay, when you said then, how else do we grow? If we have everything handed to us on a plate and life is just so easy, how can you develop empathy? How can you know what it's like to be starving? How can you know what it's like to be an abused spouse if you've
yeah.
never had any hardship in your life? So, yes.
And one of the things, you know, we are experiential. Humans are experiential beings. And one of the things that taught me so much was, as part of my job when I worked for the NHS, we did group therapy sessions. And these were, so my patients were terminally ill. You had to be terminally ill to see me. But then we did other, you know, courses for healthcare workers. And then we used to do a group therapy session for those who were bereaved. And these are the kind of things that you never forget, however many years go by, because they are so profound. And there were two of us that facilitated this group. And one day, my colleague went out of the room to go and get some photocopying done. And immediately she left the room, one of the guys said, "Can we ask you a personal question?" And I said, "Well, you can ask. I won't guarantee I'm going to answer, but fire away, you know." So he said, "Are you one of us?" So typical therapist, I'm like, "Well, you know, can you tell me what you mean by that?" He said, "Have you lost somebody?" And I said, "Well, that's an easy question to answer. Yes, I have. My husband died." And the whole room erupted. Every single participant of that group all erupted at the same time. We knew, we knew. And I said, "Well, I'm curious. Okay, so what made you know?" And his response was, "You know, we don't doubt that your colleague's good at what she does and that she's qualified and blah, blah, blah. But there's just something very different about the way you say things. When you say something into the group, you say it like you know it, like you've lived it."
Yes. There's a difference between gnosis and faith, isn't it?
Yeah.
faith is just blind hope that maybe something exists, and gnosis is knowing that when something exists.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so tempted to jump forward, Jay, just to ask about your late husband, and because obviously it ties in with the Falklands, but I don't want to sort of jump forward from your story. So so I think everybody out there can envisage what, well, maybe they can't, but what a traumatizing childhood is. So it's either abuse, isn't it, physical or mental abuse, or it could be neglect, and it could be a combination.
Yeah.
And
If
of
you look
course,
if you look at the what we call the adverse childhood experiences, and those are the things that we use in nice guidelines to see if somebody did what kind of traumas they may have had in childhood. I tick pretty much every box. So, and it's interesting actually how I've been watching a lot of podcasts lately, for different reasons. One, I love podcasts anyway, because I think you never get to a point where you know it all. Not on this earth plane. There's always something to learn in whatever way, and so there's much to be learnt by listening to other people's stories and watching other people interview and all the kind of things that go with that. But as a child, there was something in my childhood that's actually very telling with childhood trauma, and that is that I can only recall probably about 3 things prior to the age of 7. And when somebody's had a seriously traumatic childhood, that's actually quite common. So the lady that I used to call my adopted mum, for example, she could actually remember being a baby in a pram. Now, that in itself is quite unusual, though when I say a baby in a pram, that was back in the days of the perambulators, as they used to call them, where you could be 1 year old and still sat up in a pram. They didn't do the pushchair things back then. But she had a lot of childhood memories, and I just have literally 3 that I can recall up until the age of 7. And so some of the things that went on in that time, I'm privy to because I've been told. For example, one of them was and this is again highly unusual, and I know this because my mother told me. From the day I was born, my mother never bathed me, not once. She never ever gave me a bath. She wouldn't pick me up. She wouldn't hold me. She completely rejected me. And people would say to me, if I say that to them, well, who did it then? You can't have just gone dirty. And my dad used to do it when he got home from work. So I have no doubt that was the way it was, because she wouldn't really have any reason to tell me something that's pretty horrible, never bathing or holding your own child, unless it were true. Then again, as I'm told, but I have no recollection of it, my mother had a complete breakdown and was hospitalized. So there was a lot of fragmentation going on. And I can talk about these things very calmly now because I've gone through a path of discovery and forgiveness. And when I researched my first book, I went back into my family history and I wanted to find the answers to quite a few things. And you can find cause of death, for example, by getting a death certificate and that kind of thing. And there was nothing but trauma in my family. My mother was the way she was because of her own trauma. She didn't just wake up one day at whatever age and decide to be a bad person or decide to be an alcoholic. She was completely and utterly traumatized herself by the things that had happened to her in childhood, some of which she shared with me, and then by things that happened along the way. And so as a child, I was led to believe that I had an aunt that nobody spoke very nicely about her at all. She was described by everybody as in a way that I've been described over the years. And it's one of my regrets in life, actually, that as an adult, before she died, I didn't go and find her and sit down and talk to her, because you can never get that time back. But I discovered through research in my first book that my maiden aunt wasn't a maiden aunt at all. She'd actually been married for 2 years. And then by getting access to the death certificate, I discovered that what would have been my uncle killed himself in a very violent way. And yet nobody ever talked. This is an example, Chris, of an elephant in the room. The elephant that's there, nobody talks about it. That's just one incident along the way of trauma. And there were several things that happened in a very short space of time. So I've long since made peace. I mean, my mother's been dead for years now, and I wasn't in touch with her when she died. But if I had some time with her now, I could sit and say to her, you know what, this is all okay. I get why you were the way you were. And that's healing. Because until we work through stuff, we can't heal. We just carry it forward. So as a child, this really damaged woman, and I'm pretty sure now that I understand my brain better, that my mother had raging PTSD from things that had happened in her life, undiagnosed, untreated, and all the rest of it. And she managed it with pills and alcohol. And, you know, it's one of the reasons why I do talk about my story now, because we understand veteran PTSD exists, but who talks about the civilians that have it? Who talks about the women? And we'll come to that a bit later on about when I researched my book and spoke to other families, you know, about how much trauma there might be in some of those histories. But in the civilians, they're just not even looked at all. And so as a child, you know, I experienced serious neglect. I experienced severe emotional abuse, sexual abuse from within my own family. To this day, what's left of them absolutely categorically deny it happened. You know, there were so many things. And as I said to a therapist along my healing journey one day, you know, I was prime candidate to be made the scapegoat. I'm an empath. I'm very aware. I'm very sensitive to my surroundings. So I was this little kid that was saying, oh, there's an elephant in the room. And I'd be ignored. And then I'd get a bit louder and a bit louder. And eventually I would hear, shh. And then I'd try and say it again. And at the point where I was being screamed at, saying, there's no elephant in this effing room, you're just doolally and you're imagining it, was at the point that my mind was beginning to become quite fragmented. And you start thinking that there's something really wrong with you, because if everybody else can't see the elephant, maybe you are mad. But of course, I never was.
There's another elephant in the room, though, isn't there? Because I saw somewhere in your biography ADHD mentioned.
Yeah.
And my family, it's a standing joke in my family that everyone thinks that I've got it, and I prefer to think of it as Da Vinci personality. You know, so friends at home, ADHD is obviously a label that's quite stigmatizing. It's pretty superficial as well, because it doesn't address whatsoever, although it may be in more modern thinking it has started to address it, but it seems overwhelmingly, if you have an extremely a damaging childhood, that you grow up with your brain, due to the trauma behind it, it works in a certain way. and that's been labelled ADHD, but they don't explain the childhood bit. They just brand you with a label, and of course, there's another elephant in the room, isn't it? There's no one sort of talks about. So, Jay, can you tell me your experience of ADHD? What do you think it is? How does it manifest in you? What do other people say?
Yeah, I mean, I've been diagnosed with CPTSD, although, as I said, not until 2019, although it was pretty obvious that that was what was wrong. I haven't formally been diagnosed with ADHD. I wouldn't bother to go and get a diagnosis for it because I'm 68 now. What does it matter? Why do I need to know how it finally clicked into place with me? And I'm about as sure as I can be that it's exactly what's going on, and always was, is that I watched a TED talk about 5 years ago. So it's not that long ago I sussed it out. And I watched this TED talk, and this girl was talking about how lonely a life it could be, and how, she was 18 months old and she was talking, full sentences. Well, my mother used to be very proud of the fact that she could tell people that when I was 2, you could have a conversation with me and forget that I was an adult. And then this girl was saying about how it presents very differently in women, so boys get naughty and they get noticed more. But because of the way women are and the way we are in society, we're much better at fawning and masking. Well, that's even better if you're in a dysfunctional family, because you get very good at fawning. But it tends to present itself around puberty, and how, your schoolwork and things will just take a nosedive, when you suddenly find that your concentration is, and that will be partly to do with hormones changing at that time. And she started talking about all these different things, and I thought, my gosh, I tick every single box for that. Now it all makes sense. And the interesting thing is, as a child,
Jay, sorry, can you outline what these symptoms or manifestations are?
Well, I've just mentioned 2 of them, and one of them is, you're able to, your linguistic skills are very good at a very young age.
Right.
Yeah. So you will be, whereas language in children does vary. Younger siblings tend to come on a little bit if they've got someone to talk to than elder children, so it varies. And I've described about how it, boys become very hyperactive and quite naughty, and so it's a lot easier to see in a boy than it is in a girl. And girls tend to be a little bit more inhibited. Society is changing, but we're still in that place where they are. But it will be around puberty that it will start showing up in your schoolwork in other ways. But one of the things that I've got a really good friend, and she always says, you know what, Jay, you're like Marmite. You're just like Marmite. People either like you or they don't. How I describe it, this is another thing, that there's low inhibition when it comes to speaking. So, I would be that kid and grown up that people would look at me because I'd say something. And I realize now I'm older that I would just be saying what everybody's thinking. It's just that the inhibition's not there with ADHD to do that. Yeah. So you'll kind of come out with things. If you're going to miss the bus, for example, it'll come out in a way, frustration. There's a lot of, which again can coexist with addiction. There's a lot of behavior there that you can be very uninhibited with your behavior. So it's like an umbrella of things, of the way you will present in the world. But there's much less inhibition with people with ADHD. And I've learned, and I think one of the good things about getting older is my brain still works faster than most people's, but it's a little bit slower now, so I can normally hold my tongue when I'm thinking something, rather than finding that I've said it as I thought it. So, many different ways it can present itself. I think, what is scary is that as a child, I was literally top of the class in primary school. I came third in the county in the 11 plus. And then suddenly my schoolwork starts to fail miserably at around age 13. And then we moved. So I went to a different school and nobody noticed or cared. I mean, that's pretty indicative that there's something very wrong going on in the background, whatever that something is. Nobody looked at it.
Yes. Well, nothing's really looked at, is it? I heard they got a point. My friend is a headmistress in Australia, and she said they've got a point system now that they assign to children. And I guess they use a multi-agency approach where they look at a pupil, they look at the factors in their background, like, absent father or not, parental separation, divorce, hints at, contact with social work, which obviously is most likely some form of neglect or abuse, etc., etc., etc. And they build up this picture of a child based on this system. And if they are likely to face addiction down the line, which, as we know, is self-medicating, you're literally you're medicating yourself for trauma that society doesn't understand and doctors don't understand, and it can go, as in our cases, it's gone. No one's ever diagnosed me anything, Jay. I've worked it all out for myself, and like yourself, I've never been to any self-help groups or churches or anything like that. I'm just too independent for that. And
I think it's important that I do put in there, and I have said it earlier, that to become a therapist you have to do work on yourself. So although I didn't do group work in that sense, doing a program or anything, I've done years and years and years of therapy. And what I would definitely say is I've had some really, really good therapists. I've also had some really, really bad ones. And I think for me, well, I'm going to change my language with that. I'm not going to say I think, I'm going to say I know that, because it's a bit like if you're a doctor and you go and see another doctor and you have medical knowledge, you can very quickly see whether the other doctor's any good at what they do or not. I really feel sad and I worry about so many people out there that may end up with quite bad therapists who are experiencing transference and projection in their sessions and don't even realize it, and they are being manipulated and they're not getting the best. Things are changing dramatically now, for sure. But I give you an example. Okay, so if I can, and an addiction can show up in many different ways. Let's be clear, it's not just all about drink and drugs. Yeah. So eating disorders, which is something I did a completely separate qualification in. And I think we've got an absolute pandemic of problems with eating now in the Western world that people aren't looking at, because that's another coping mechanism. If I don't want to feel, I can squash it down with food. It's just another symptom of the same problem. So when I was 16 years old, I became anorexic. And, living in a family where they're pretending there's no elephant in the room, it got to a point where I was so skeletal. I weighed 6 stone, which I'm not exactly big now, but it's almost 3 stone lighter than I am today. And so my family was one that, as long as nobody in the outside world could notice it, we can pretend it's not going on. But of course, you can't hide a skeletal child unless they're locked in the house and never go out. So my mother marched me to the doctor one day, and she said, you need to sort this child out. She's either anemic or lazy. She's got no energy. So the elephant in the room was I had anorexia. And my mother's telling the doctor that I'm either anemic or lazy. I didn't even know, excuse me, I didn't even know until I looked at my own medical records. I wasn't told, no help was sought. Because you see, if, as it would be today, there would be an automatic referral to psychological services, that didn't happen back when I was 16. So I didn't actually know I'd been diagnosed with anorexia until I was in my early 40s, and I had to get my medical records for something else. And I read it in black and white. I thought, my gosh. And there it said in black and white, weight 6 stone, blood pressure 90/60. So it was amazing. I was even stood up, let alone, you know. And literally no help was sought. I wasn't even told. And then I'm going to be kind of going backwards and forwards a little bit with this, because it then manifested after Gary was killed. And I actually paid privately to go and see a psychiatrist. And I will give you an example of a very bad therapist here. And this is before, by the way, I'd even started studying psychology. This was literally, you know, the year after Gary died. And I said to this doctor, I've got a problem. Whenever severe trauma hits, I become anorexic. And I want to do some work on this, because I don't want to I want to find better ways to cope. I don't want to spend the rest of my life like this. His response was, well, you're very young and very pretty, and I think the best thing you can do is go and get married again and write me a prescription for antidepressants. Now, all these years later, having studied as much as I have and understanding psychology the way I do now, I question in my mind, what about me was making him so uncomfortable that he couldn't even hear me? But the results of that consultation were catastrophic, because I was a child who'd been led to believe, as the family scapegoat, that I was the problem. I've gone to see a doctor to try and get help and say, look, I recognize I've got a pattern here and I've got a problem here. Can you help me do something about it? And he then tells me, well, you're very young, very pretty, and the best thing you do is go, you know, the cure is go and get married again. So it then gives me the message, you're the problem here. Again, it just compounds the thing that you've already grown up with. Bearing in mind your 0 to 7 years are your hard drive, you know, that's when your programming happens. So I've already got a problem. I can't remember those years, and you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So how can you possibly find what you can't remember? It's already complicated. And then I've got a doctor, and back in those days, you know, I, like many people, thought doctors were God. They knew, and if they said it must be. So I thought, oh, okay, that's the answer then. I just need to go and find myself a new partner.
And did you?
Yeah. And I found, and again, this is where the unconscious comes in. Because instead of doing the work that I've now done, that if I'd have done it 40 years ago, would have been so much more beneficial, which is when I was asking for direct me to help, you know. I unconsciously attracted another soldier. And I've written about some of it in my book, but all I need to say here is that prior to being with that guy, I used to actually be very judgmental about, you know, people like, do you remember Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper?
Yes.
And I used to always say, how can people be with somebody like that and not know? Until I had that relationship. And bit by bit by bit, I discovered this person was completely leading a double life. He was serving in the military when I met him, but he got out. And like many people that served in the military, he also had a traumatic childhood. He fell apart. And all I need to say about what happened there is that I had everybody from the bailiffs to the fraud squad at my door after we broke up. There was a lot of violence in the relationship. There was stalking when there were no stalking laws. I couldn't do anything about anything because he was friends with half the local coppers. And I had to literally, when my life was under threat, disappear and move to London. Because I had attracted my trauma, just remanifested it somewhere else.
So, what was your turning point or your epiphanal moment, if there was one? Or some guests just say to me, "No, Chris, it's been a gradual process to get to where I am now." I had a few epiphanal moments. I mean, just to give people an idea, forgiving my parents was just such an easy one to do, and such an obvious one. Was, hang on, if I need to understand myself, which I do because I'm killing myself pretty quickly here, I need to understand them instead of just seeing them as an object of blame. What was their childhoods like? What were their parents like? Oh my God, they were in a very weird generation. God, that's a whole generation about behind what goes on behind closed doors. Children should be seen and not heard. It's better to be a solicitor than a refuse collector. All this weirdly perverted way of thinking that they had. And that was put onto, and then post-war, that in itself has, implications. So I actually ended up feeling really, really sorry for them. And that was it. That was easy to put that one to bed to allow me to sort of move on. And then later I genuinely had that epiphanal see the light moment where suddenly everything fell into place. What the hell am I doing to myself? You're actually a nice guy, Chris. Stop it. You don't need to be doing, you don't need to be taking all these drugs and living in a hot, just get it back, son. Just look after yourself and get it all back. And that's, that was for me. But like I say, some people say, no, because I never had that. I just sort of worked at it, and here I am today.
I think, looking back on my life now, and I'm probably the strongest I've ever been, and never thought. I mean, when I was diagnosed with CPTSD in 2019, the doctor who diagnosed me very kindly said to me, and I still get emotional when I think of this, he said, "I don't think you're coming back from it this time." And that was really hard to hear. And this time was a medical negligence. And I've had a few aha moments, and I've done a lot of therapy, as I said, over the years. But that medical negligence was for sure my complete turning point. Because in different guises, everybody that failed to diagnose me and actually nearly killed me because of it, and I'm not being dramatic when I say that, how I'm still here is just, it wasn't my time. Because people with the condition I had have died in less time than I was diagnosed and finally got surgery. And, you know, from the doctor who failed to diagnose me, who was incredibly charming, but actually, you know, wasn't even looking for what the problem was, which is quite worrying in itself, to all of it, and I went up against, you know, as a litigant in person, I went up against the NHS, because initially the solicitors were dealing with it, but the report didn't go in our favour. So then it's, what do we do? So you're already on the back foot because you haven't, you know, you're acting as your own lawyer. And in that moment, you know, the things, the mind games, the things that I found out, the redacted notes, the notes that didn't have a time on them, so you couldn't tell when things happened, you know, the tramadol overdose that wasn't recorded, the incident report that they tried to hide from me. You know, there were so many things along the way, and the games that they played. Finally, I began to get acceptance around the fact that I wasn't the mad one in my family. I was the one that was very clearly saying, there's an elephant in the room, and nobody wanted to hear that. And so when this medical negligence happened, I had my own GP ringing me up and saying, I just had the facts. I've just seen what's happened. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You know, this is like it's such a small window when this happens to get treatment. And she knows how long they left me in the, you know, I shouldn't still be here. And I'm actually having people saying to me, no, this is wrong. And yet nobody wants to take responsibility. Well, hey, what does that mirror? That mirrored my dysfunctional childhood completely. So you left me, didn't diagnose me, nearly killed me, but now you want to pretend that you didn't do it and it didn't happen? No. And there.
Jay, sorry, is this a specific incident you're talking about? Are you talking about your complex trauma in general?
No. This is I went into hospital in excruciating pain.
Right.
And if I say my pain was 10 on morphine and tramadol, that gives you an idea how severe the pain was. And I was left 24 hours. And I kept asking for a doctor, and they kept saying, oh, no, there's no doctor available. I mean, it was just horrendous. If you read the medical notes, it was horrendous. And they left me for 24 hours while my bowel burst.
Oh, wow.
Hence, that was the reason I was in excruciating pain, because something serious was going on. Now, once your bowel bursts, you go to, which they found me the following day with 2-quadrant peritonitis. By the time they operated, I had been left hours. You know, emergency CT scan took like 4 hours. It was hours and hours and hours, by which time you go rapidly in that situation to sepsis and organ failure and death. It's a very rapid progression. And when I was researching for the court case, I found people who had died in much less time than I got my surgery.
Gosh.
And they were still making out. Because nobody wants to take responsibility. If you try and claim anything, you know, unless it's what they call a never event, you know, which is, for example, if somebody dies and it could have been avoided, but unless it's a never event, the NHS will never stick their hands up and say, yeah, that happened. But the mind games they played against me, with me being my own lawyer, was particularly cruel because I had PTSD. It's cruel enough with people, with somebody that doesn't have it, you know. So it was like something inside of me just came up and thought, no, this has got to be the last time this shit happens. I'm not being told that this didn't happen, and I'm not being told that they're not wrong. And it was a process that started really freeing me from my family of dysfunction. because that's what happens in life. Anything we don't process will rock up somewhere else by way of a different relationship, different circumstance. You know that. You've done the journey. And then a year after this happened, and that was a 6-month recovery, because there was complications after the surgery, and it took a 6-month recovery. And then a year later, I had a stress cardiomyopathy with a cardiac arrest. And I would say, being fair, 50% of that was what had happened to me the year before, and then 50% was other stuff. But interestingly, when I was having an echo done the day after it happened, this young doctor, I'll never forget, he was a lovely guy. He said to me, have you been particularly stressed lately? And I jokingly said, oh yeah, for about the last 50 years. And he said, no, I mean, lately, have you been particularly? And I said, I'm not joking. I've had relentless stress for the last 50 years. And then he showed me my left ventricle on the, the echo, told me it's called a stress cardiomyopathy, otherwise known as Takotsubo or broken heart syndrome. And of course, when they'd gone to do the angiogram to try and find out what was causing my symptoms, because the left ventricle wasn't pumping properly, the minute they'd given me a sedative, the heart just stopped. So, and here's the thing, in that year, when the medical negligence happened, I couldn't have had worse care. The hospital I was in was under special measures. I couldn't have possibly had worse care if they tried, unless they'd left me even longer and I'd actually died, A year later, the same hospital, I couldn't have had better care. Because it's actually not as easy as it looks like on Casualty to restart your heart when it stopped, And there was none of this charging at 150 and all that malarkey. They whacked me straight in at 360. And then that didn't work. So more drugs, and they whacked me at 360 again. In between, they're doing 2 minutes of chest compressions while, there's no beat there. And I've come round to, to this sea of people, which was the crash team, thinking, what the hell's gone on? And this doctor saying, oh, don't worry, the morphine will kick in a minute. And I'm thinking, why do I need morphine? I only came in for an angiogram, so that was, but I'm going to say something now that may make me emotional. And if it does, then that's fine, because I was on the cardiac ward for 9 days. Oh, might have to edit that bit out. I was on the cardiac ward for 9 days, and when I came home, I got into my own bed that night, and my life was pretty shitty by then, with everything that had happened. And it's all very well being the scapegoat, but to get well, you can't be around people that are pretending these things didn't happen. You can't heal and mix with people who are in full denial. It doesn't work. So, I lost all my family along the way. And so it was a really lonely journey, So I was just surprised I didn't get broken heart syndrome a long time before it happened. But that night I got into bed and I cried myself to sleep, and I just put it over to a higher power. And I said, either take me or heal me, because I can't do this anymore. And the most beautiful golden light came down from somewhere and bathed me, just bathed me in this light. And so, no, there wasn't just one aha moment. It's been a long, painful process at times. But there have been some incredible things along the way. And one of them was my husband, who wasn't perfect. Neither am I, but we were best friends. And his death absolutely crucified me. And the other was finding bodybuilding, because had I not been able to channel so much of the rage that came from my childhood into that, I probably would have ended up in jail, I would imagine. And I think there's a lot of people that can relate to that.
And can we talk a bit about what happened in the Falklands?
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a few paras on to talk about Goose Green and Longdon, and your husband was killed at Goose Green.
Yeah.
How is that? I mean, you're 24, which we both know now is, I look at 24-year-olds, they're very young adults, aren't they? The word child comes to mind in without trying to sound patronizing, what did you think when can we say his name, or do you want to keep that out? I just feel rude saying him.
No, his name was Gary.
Yeah.
I had a nickname for him that I've never made public and probably never will. That was very intimate between us. But most of his mates called him Gaz. I personally always called him Gary.
Yeah.
We actually got married when we were 19. So if you're talking about 24 being young, we'd been married 5 years. And so one of the things that has been particularly difficult in me going through the grief process, and indeed my second book, The Falklands Widow, is actually my individual journey through grief, is that usually when you have an ambivalent grief reaction, it is because you have an ambivalence in your relationship with the person. And it took me a lot of years to work out, as part of this grief process, a place that I was kind of quite stuck in. Because at my very core, I'm a Reiki master, I was a holistic therapist, I'm very spiritual. And I met and fell in love with this paratrooper who was all about the parachute regiment and loved everything that he did. One of the last things he said to me before he left was, "I've waited 6 years for this." It's what he was trained to do. But when we got married, and I think it was incredibly mature of us as 19-year-olds, because you're still teenagers, you think you've grown up, but you're not. We made a decision. At that time, I called myself agnostic because I'd been brought up Church of England, but I didn't quite relate to all of that. I knew I believed in something, wasn't sure what at that stage. He was a Methodist. And obviously I was a pacifist and he was a soldier. So at the grand old age of 19, when we got married, we made a pact that we would never talk about religion. We would never talk about politics and respect each other's differences. And that was fine in the marriage. But after he went out and got himself killed in a war, there was a part of my anger that was very buried for a very long time, because what he was actually doing went against who I am as a person. And it took me a long time to pull those threads together and process that.
When you say what he was doing, can you elaborate on?
Just being a soldier and going to war. If you're a pacifist and you believe that things should be resolved by understanding, differences and talking things through and whatever, and you don't, in your heart of hearts, you don't aspire to war, it's hard to be with somebody who loves every minute of the action.
Yeah, this is the paradox, isn't it? This is the paradox, and again, we live in a incredibly deluded society. How many of those young men joined up to prove themselves because of the neglect they experienced during childhood?
Well, here's the thing, Chris, and I've heard you say this before, and I'm 100% with you on it. The reality of war to what you're trained for and what you're led to believe it's going to be like are two completely different things. And the reality for human beings is that unless you're killing, as we did back in the day when we hunted to survive for food, yeah, or you're a psychopath, it's not normal to kill. And so the reality is that you get these young men of varying ages, bearing in mind that many of them were only 17 still. Gary was an old crow. An old sweat. You know, he was leading the crows. You know, he'd done 6 years man service, and he'd been in junior leaders before that. So he was a very experienced soldier. But the reality of going into, and I've spoken to so many veterans over the years, more with PTSD than not. Many who won't get treatment for it, that's their choice. But the reality of war to what you think it's going to be, it is something completely different. Then you've got to live with the things that happened, the things that you did, the things that you watched happen to people that you care about. And all for what? Because it's always about greed. It's always about land, or it's about religion, or it's about one set of people's egos wanting to take control of another set. You know, it's always about a power struggle of some kind. And here we are in 2025, and as human beings, we're still doing the same stuff, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. What a lot of people don't know about the Falklands is that there was a peace deal on the table. It was brokered by an obscure country. I can't remember which one, but Margaret Thatcher received it and allegedly just said, make that disappear. Because they didn't want peace. They wanted a war. And then another factor is that the Falkland Islands aren't the Falkland Islands. Well, as in they're not, they're not owned by the people that inhabit it. They're owned by the Falkland Islands Company. So now this has got brings to mind the East India Company and the De Beers South Africa diamonds mining and. But whatever you say, whatever way people want to look at it, it just is so bizarre, isn't it? Sending teenagers to kill other teenagers, to make an ugly cabal of elitist or wannabe elitist merchant bankers even richer and more powerful than they already are. And talk about the elephant in the room. I mean, look at Afghanistan. All the military want to do is if I say stroke each other, I think people understand what I'm getting at, and chuck medals on each other and all tell each other what massive heroes they are. And
well, here's another problem with grief. Here's another problem with grief, and I write about this in my book. Anger is one of the phases of grief. So you have the denial, you have the bargaining, you have the depression, you have the anger, and you have the acceptance. You have these phases of grief, which don't all go in chronological order. They are interactive, but they all have to be processed if you're going to come through the other side. How do you get angry, fully angry at somebody who's a war hero and who everybody else has got up on a pedestal? But for sure you're angry because they were your love, they were your husband, they were your best friend, they were the person that you could talk into the wee hours and tell anything to, and they've gone out and got themselves killed in a war. And that's what your mind is telling you. And then you try and rationalize it by the fact that you married them and you supported their career and it was their job. But you still have that anger because you've been abandoned. Death is the ultimate abandonment. It's not like getting divorced and you may or may not be able to become friends later. They're gone. But not only are they gone, you know, having left my life behind and deciding that I would support him in his career, because that's how it works. They get another posting, you pack up and you move. You've got the next 22 years of your life mapped out, and suddenly that life is gone. And you're just chucked out back into Civvy Street to fend for yourself.
Yes, it's an interesting. It's interesting what happens to you when you join the military. Because when I joined the Marines, I can honestly tell you, Jay, I joined because it offered me some hope for someone that didn't have very much else on the horizon. I mean, I was literally homeless at 17 when I decided, or when my mate bet me I couldn't join, and that was it. I went, yes, I can. And when I read those recruitment brochures, I was just thinking, of the excitement of it all, that I could get into this and be doing these exciting things, and B, how manageable it was for me, because they weren't asking for supermen. They wanted someone that could do 50 press-ups. Well, I could probably do 100. They wanted someone that could do 5 pull-ups. I could do 30. You know, there was I think with everyone, there's a, you know, the wall you've got to climb, quite literally, in the Marines, actually, for some people. But for me, it was the speed marching. I just really, being quite a light person, I found it quite hard. But what I'm getting to is, so I just joined up as something to do, something that was going to pay me money, something that I could be incredibly proud of. And, you know, I say to this day, getting into the Marines was my most proudest moment of my life. And it you know, people always say, oh, it's when you have your first child. It's like, no, it's not. Having my first child was like, yeah, okay. Bloody hell, 18 years of this now. No, I'm joking, but no, that moment when they said, pat yourselves on the backs, fellas. There was only like 3 of us left or something. You've all just joined the Royal Marines. I was like, oh my God, I was so proud. Can't ever put that in, can't explain that to any. Anyway, my point is, by the time I passed out of training, certainly by the time I was serving in the Northern Ireland conflict, all that had changed. I was there to kill. That was my job, was to kill. I hate to use the American expression, but the bad guys. And of course, when you're indoctrinated 19-year-old, anyone that's not white British was the bad guy. And that's the power of the programming that you go through.
Yeah.
You know, that's it. And I'm not here to justify it or condemn it. I'm just here to talk about, have an honest talk about it. Falklands.
And I think that was the thing, Chris, for True Para, with more than a lot of other people that served in the Falklands, was that In 1979, after we finished the Berlin tour that we had out there, Two Para went to Ballykinler for 18 months. And it was only a month after they went over there that Warren Point happened. So there was an almost equal amount of people killed in Warren Point from Two Para that were killed at Goose Green. You know, it was very, very close in numbers. So it was a huge, heinous attack. And I think the excitement of going to a proper war was that in Ireland, you couldn't, you know, if you got a remote control bomb, somebody, you know, just blows you up when you're in a convoy. That's not the same as knowing where the enemy is and you've got a fair fight on your hands. In a war like the Falklands, it's kill or be killed, which is what war is about. When you're fighting terrorism, you're fighting very often something unseen. So I think after many, you know, Gary in his lifetime had done 2 tours. He was on a tour of Ireland. I met him on his R&R on his 19th birthday, actually. So he'd done 2 tours of Ireland. Many of the guys that were a bit older had done more. And so the Troubles, as we call them, why on earth they called them that, I don't know. But it was a whole different thing to going to war. And I think that's why, as we get older, and certainly after, you know, I'm not here anymore, the Falklands will continue to be a war of great interest, you know, as people die off from, you know, other generations. We haven't got many World War II people left now. Because it was the last analog war that would ever be fought. Military things have changed now. You know, you've got drones, you've got IEDs, you know, everything's different with warfare now to the way it was in that war. And I'll never call it, I mean, we can call it a war apparently now, but for many years, of course, it was called a conflict. Well, you know.
Yeah, I never. Was there a reason why they called it a conflict and not a war?
Yeah, because war was never actually officially declared and it was over in 74 days.
And if it was war, then we would have been bombing mainland Argentina, I suppose, and vice versa, if they had the capability.
Well, that kind of is like so many other things, a question mark. It's a bit like saying, well, how much could World War II have been contained? You know, it just got bigger and bigger as more countries were invaded. So, you know, it was on paper just the fight for the islands, and the British took them really quickly. So, you know, I must say, I don't read anything and everything about that war. I know a lot of things that are not in the public domain. I was very good friends. He's passed now, but the communications officer at the time. And there's a lot about that war that hasn't come into the public domain yet. You know, there's the 30-year rule. When the 30-year rule, it came to the 30th anniversary of the Falklands, some files were released, 2 Para files. I think if I might be wrong, but I think I'm correct in saying they have been withheld until 2057. In other words, when we're all dead. I mean, I'd certainly be 100, you know. So there's a lot of things that I know that I don't need to say out loud that are not public knowledge. You know, some people know, some people don't. It's like everything, you know. We're back to that elephant in the room, aren't we, Chris? You know, it's like, how honest are you going to be about what the elephant actually is there? And, you know, we can see him, and what's he actually really doing? So, you know, it's never as clear cut as it appears to be. And for me personally, I'm very protective of my peace these days. I spend less and less time on social media now. I use it like you do because you kind of need to do certain things for, you know, what you're doing. I try on my Instagram to inspire women to exercise. You know, I've got an author page, but I've got one that I do my fitness stuff on. But when it comes to other platforms, which I won't even name them, but, you know, I just see so much virtue signaling and nonsense. It's
And
just,
trauma.
oh, you know, I came off for a while because it's the anniversary of the Falklands starts on the 2nd of April. There is a person, I won't mention his name, but many people are aware of him, and he wasn't in the war, and he's not English, and he has ingratiated, for want of a better word, himself into that class of 82, you know, group of people. And for many years, one of the things that haunted me, and it's still one of the most awful things if it ever comes on, is my husband and the service where they were all buried in a mass grave after Goose Green. What is particularly and was hard for me is that my promise to Gary was that if anything happened to him before me, I would have him cremated, because he actually had a phobia about being buried in the ground. Neither of us thought of the logistics of a war 8,000 miles away where there isn't even a crematorium. But I'm a person, and as all good scapegoats, you know, I've got a high sense of justice and doing what's right. That's what makes us who we are. And it was horrendous for me, knowing that he was buried in the ground, the one thing that I promised him would never happen. And that, for whatever reason, that service was televised. And I think I'm right in saying that the Falklands was the first televised war anyway. So there was a lot of things that came out in the media that you wouldn't normally have seen prior to then. And this year, this person put on I don't even know where on earth they got this extended video piece. And to me, it was the most disgusting thing to put online, where they were actually not just showing the service and the mass grave for the service, but the camera was zooming in on the actual tags on the body bags. And in my head, I think, why? Why would you do that?
Well, because
And
the BBC is the mouthpiece for the Satanists. That's why they.
oh, no. This wasn't the BBC doing it. This was this guy who's ingratiated himself into the Falklands
Oh,
veteran
okay.
on social media.
Oh yeah, you get some right Charlies. I mean, it's the whole thing is, it's such a clever scam that they played on society. They send you to their, you know, quote unquote illegal conflicts for their war, their oil, their opium, you know, diamonds, whatever it might be. And then, you know, they give you a good boy medal for doing it. And then later in life, rather than understand the game and reject it because our children deserve better, that's a true hero. No, they go into ego self, polish their medals up, and go out and pretend that, you know, and it's you know, what do you say? War is an ass. It's people are just quite pathetic in a lot of ways, and I'm not picking on any individual.
No, but when you've got somebody who wasn't in the war and has nothing to do with it, who's trying to ingratiate themselves into a group of people and a group of traumatized people, because let's not pretend, you know, there's so many veterans out there that are still very traumatized. And then you're putting footage like that online for family members to see, and you have no respect of how much re-traumatization that might cause. What is going on in your brain and your mind that you think that's an okay thing to do?
Yeah, during the Afghanistan, at one point, some, like I say, Charlie decided to post a picture of an Afghani or an Afghan, excuse me for, turn away now, folks, if you don't want to hear something graphic. It's not awful, but it's graphic. But the guy literally lost all of his head to a British sniper or American sniper, an Allied sniper. And I don't know where this photo had surfaced online, but it must have been on some pretty graphic website. And this guy just decided to post it, bang smack in a veterans Facebook group.
Oh.
And it was just, how old are you? At what point in your life did you just not grow up and realize that people don't want to, I mean, there are people that want to see that stuff, post it on the pages where people want to see that kind of thing, but you've just posted that in a group where someone's probably eating their cornflakes with their child sat next to them, and it's a human life. See, whether you want to taint them as Taliban or whatever, it's still yes, funny.
And that kind of brings me on to how I wrote the last book that I published, which took 7 years to research, and how at the back of all of these battles and wars and events and things that go on are the mothers and the sisters and the widows and the siblings and the children of those people that got killed.
And how was it for them, Jay? What stories have you been told?
Well, again, we're back to over the 7 years I was researching, I built up a solid reputation, in the sense that you can, a bit like a therapist needs to have, you can tell me anything. It's not going to go public. The only things that I will make public are the things that need, so the book, The Falklands Fallen, it's never been done before. It's the first of its kind in military history. And what it is there are some aspects of how people died, but it's more little stories about who these people were, who their parents were they married, did they have any children, where did they go to school, just who these people actually were. Because we see names on memorials all over the place, whether it's from World War I, World War II, anywhere. And unless you actually know somebody, you're not going to know anything about their life. You're not going to know who they were. And of course, no criticism to World War I and those eras, because there were millions of them. So how are you going to log all their stories? I volunteer for the Commonwealth War Graves as a speaker, and they're doing great things now in terms of putting little things online, for who this person was in this war. And there's something very interesting, and I'm going to split this in two ways. In one, in terms of the families, and some families were very close and others were as dysfunctional as mine. So, some of the things that people have shared with me, and I needed to be at a certain strength within my own emotional self and grounded enough to be able to hear all these stories and be able to hold that space for those people. And there are still people that wouldn't speak to me because they're still really traumatized, and we're now 43 years later. My book came out last November, and I've been researching it for I was still researching right up until the last edit to tweak things, because there were, one widow in America, for example, died while I was writing, and so I was updating things as I went along. So I think there's a huge lack of respect for what families have actually been through. in terms of their pain and their suffering. And the feedback I've had from the book has been nothing but positive in, you know, thank you for bringing to life the people that we've lost. Some of them, there's only a short paragraph. It really depends on how much information, you know, in an ideal world, they'd all have an equal amount of words. But here's another thing that I have found throughout my life. And, you know, you talk a lot about ego. And so I know you and I are on the same page when we talk about certain things, is that I've written the book in alphabetical order. So it's the whole roll of honor for everybody that died in the Falklands. And the only separation is between the service personnel and the 3 civilians that died. So there's no chapters. It's just literally in alphabetical order, because that way there's no favor for rank or service. So what you actually have is you have a snapshot of who the person was, and in death they are all equal. They all gave their life for their country. Over the years, and here's a very interesting thing that I just kind of smile and nod now if I get asked this question. When we're talking about egos, if somebody actually says to me in a conversation when they first meet me and they know that I'm a war widow, oh, what rank was your husband? I know exactly the kind of person I'm speaking to. And it will come out later in the conversation, and I can see a sort of half smile on your face. You know, I think you know where I'm coming from on that one. It's not about the fact that I'm a war widow and he gave his life for his country and he got a medal for bravery and all those other things, for what he did at the time and everything. It's about, what is your place in society, Jay? If somebody asks that question, that's how they're looking at me. He was actually an NCO, right? Had he had a better life, he could have been anything, because my IQ is round about 130. And believe you me, my husband's IQ matched mine. He just didn't have the education. That was his childhood. That was his background, yeah? So why are you judging somebody by how many stripes or pips he's got on his uniform? And since he's died, you know, when I've dated doctors or barristers or, you know, army colonels or whatever, because I have the choice as to who I date, you know, now I'm single, they're not interested in what rank my husband was. They're actually interested in whether they want to date Jay. So, you know, this ego that comes into, you know, that crops up in conversations like that, I find really just rather ugly. Because when you're dead, and it's irrelevant how many millions you've got in the bank or what car you used to drive when you were alive or anything else. When you're dead, you're dead.
Yes. It's amazing as well how many people are held in trauma because they didn't join the forces, or they didn't join a quote unquote elite regiment. And I meet a lot of people like that, and the way they introduce themselves is, "Hi, Chris. Well, I was never in the Marine." I'm like, what a fucking weird thing to say. Jesus Christ, that's the first thing on your mind when you meet me, is you feel the need to explain. And it's because everyone's been indoctrinated into hero worship in the forces rather than understand the reality of it. And the reality of it is quite often very different.
But here's the thing, Chris. Here's the thing with this whole rank thing that I've been telling you about. You know, if somebody asks me that in a conversation, only people who feel less than, or who see themselves only by things that are external to them rather than have a grounded sense of self would ever ask that question.
Yes, there's a lot of, there's a lot of conditioning, isn't there, in life? And it's funny, it's kind of all changing a bit now. Because obviously I speak to colonels and all kind of, and they call me mate. it's and I guess a lot, I guess an awful lot of the people joining up these days have got a degree, so they're on that university level with their officers. It's quite interesting how how that will go. I should say, it's such a paradox. I'm just a realist. I understand what the military industrial complex is. I understand who it supports, who it's funded by. It's us, the taxpayer. You've only got to look at Ukraine. You've got Kolomoisky, third richest billionaire in Ukraine, currently in prison, I think, which tells you all you need to know. Global mafia, who brought to power a sadomasochistic actor. I mean, an actor who played, an S&M role in gay music videos, brought him to power through his television station that he owned. At the same time, these guys, or Kolomoisky, funded the Azov, which is a right-wing nationalist, basically we hate the Jews party. So anyone that understands the irony going on there understands that it's all a game. All the stuff you hear about this, that, and it's all a carefully orchestrated game. And when the likes of Kolomoisky want to achieve an end, they just do what they want to do, regardless of ethnicity, race, Second World War. That they don't care about any of that. That's for us guys to be brainwashed with, and to have things we can't talk about, and all this utter crass nonsense. And this is why I'm just and I see the same criminals are the same people behind the medical narrative. And I know that's a crime narrative because, you've only got to research, for example, Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp to see when the split came between blaming other people for your health and taking responsibility for your health. One of them doesn't earn them any money, So the reason why I might sound a bit, I don't wish to be offensive to anyone, Jay, but it's just that it's a big club and we're not in it. And until we start getting over our ego and saying, do you know what? I ain't wearing these medals. They're just, they're trinkets, aren't they? They're war trinkets designed to make me feel like a bit of a hero on Remembrance Day. And really, so I don't tell the children the true nature of war, what it was really like growing up, what a lot of the people that you serve with were like, because they weren't all very nice, the harsh reality. But to the other side of the coin, I'll be eternally proud of what our forces did what they endured in the Falklands. And the utter bravery of charging up a hill knowing that you might not be coming back down. And some of them were 18 years. I mean, I've had people on my show that were 17 when they were down there. They couldn't go ashore and join the scrap until they were 18. And I won't want anyone to think that it brings tears to my mate, the guy that bet me up.
I would stop you there, actually, because they could go ashore and join the scrap before they were 18.
Oh, they could do.
You had the choice, and there were 7. I mean, I've written about several teenagers, but there were 3 17-year-olds killed at Mount Longdon.
Wow.
I say 3. One of them actually is not quite true. One of them was actually killed on his 18th birthday. He was injured on his 18th birthday, and in typical, I love the sense of humour, and I mean, with my sense of humour, it doesn't always go down well in Civvy Street. It kind of is what it is. It's that dark sense of humour. And one of his mates, when all the tracers were going off, was saying, something about the neighbours might be complaining about the noise at his birthday party, because it was his 18th. So yeah, there were sadly 17-year-olds that were actually killed. I kind of, it's okay with you, I'd like to read a quote out of one of my books, because I think what we're talking about here, and there is a great change going on throughout the world as consciousness is changing. And I think historically, there's so many things that we're talking about elephants in the room, but there's lots of different elephants in lots of different rooms. And that's just the subject matter, isn't there? But there's a quote that I put at the beginning of my chapter called The Dark Night of the Soul. And I think for those people, Dark Night of the Soul who don't understand it, it's not depression. It's not just a bad day or a bad event or whatever. The dark night, the true dark night of the soul, which is part of my journey and my awakening, was a period of time. And to have a true dark night of the soul, you have to completely get to the edge of losing faith in everything. Because if you don't, it's just not the dark night of the soul. So this quote I put at the beginning of that chapter: when you judge other people without wanting to know the true story behind their actions, is usually when there is something inside of you that is so broken that if you found out what you believed about them was a lie, you wouldn't want to accept it or make amends. And that's a quote by somebody called Shannon L. Alder. I love some of her quotes. And I think we've kind of covered a lot of things in this conversation, which has been great. But one of the things you asked me was about my journey, and I think I need to make it clear that the reason it took so long was because there was that quote says it all. I had a family that were denying everything that had happened and pretending that it didn't. Because they were so broken that if they had actually, as that quote said, admitted, this is true, this is what we did to you, this is what happened, then that you then have to look at what's broken inside of yourself. And I want to bring this into the conversation because I think it's so important. I do talk openly about the sexual abuse in my history now. And I do that more and more because so many more people, as I'm sure they do with you through your podcast, share their experiences with me. And when you speak something out loud and you actually acknowledge the elephant in the room, it gives other people permission to do so too. And my journey, sexual abuse actually fragments the soul. It wounds the soul in a way that other traumas don't. That doesn't mean other traumas aren't terrible and they aren't awful. But if you look at how a scapegoat is formed as opposed to a narcissist, there is something called splitting that occurs. So with a narcissist, the splitting occurs in the sense that, they can't deal with reality. So they then manifest this fake reality and this grandiose sense of self. And that's their new story. And that's the splitting that occurs. With people like me, with empaths and people specifically who become scapegoats, the splitting occurs in cognitive dissonance. So what's happening is there's a part of you that knows that what's happening to you is terribly wrong. Everything about it feels wrong on every level. But people refuse to admit. And then they'll give you scraps of, maybe you'll have a good day because you get taken to the beach or something. Because you'll rarely find a childhood. I mean, there are, sadly, but you know, there are extreme cases. But in most childhoods, especially when there's narcissistic abuse going on, that's the game. The game is we'll screw your mind up, but we'll feed you, you know, a bit of niceness every now and again to completely confuse you. And so splitting happens with empaths and scapegoats in the sense of cognitive dissonance. So they have the truth on one hand, and then they have the lie that's fed to them on the other. And so that's where the confusion and the splitting comes with that. And to heal, you have to put those two things back together again. And that's something that narcissists don't do because they've got no investment to ever go to that level of pain. You know, they function in the world differently. So there are lots of people out there like Dr. Ramani and Richard Brannon and, you know, many people out there now that do really good work. Narcissism wasn't actually even really studied until the 1950s. You know, so these are quite new sciences. The reason I'm bringing this into the conversation at this stage is that we are still, and we had this chat before we started recording, we are still getting suicides from wars like the Falklands. It wasn't that many years ago that one of the guys that was injured at Warren Point took his own life. Now, I'm not saying that all of those people have been through that kind of abuse, but I have privately spoken to many veterans who, because I've been open about mine, they've told me their stories. And it's far more prevalent than we are led to believe. And also, so I am a believer, you know, in what, and I love that some of the podcasts that you were doing when you talk about child trauma, is that we have to get to a place just in society whereby, veteran or not, we have to get to a place where we really do acknowledge childhood trauma and we facilitate that healing.
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be a conversation that's just embedded in our daily lives. And so when you see someone doing the old road rage, beeping their horn, you can go, childhood trauma, unhealed, mate, go and sort it out. Stop taking it out on other people. You know, so it becomes a thing rather than go, oh, look at that knobhead over there beeping it. You know, people, it's called being trauma informed, isn't it? You know,
yes. Yeah.
How many people online have no clue about trauma before they set about attacking someone? Some of the comments that people will leave about another individual with no thought whatsoever that person might be on their last thread. They might be feeling their self-worth might be an all-time low, and yet they've got 1,000 people in a comment section attacking them in the military case because they put their berry on a bit wrong. And they've got 1,000 grown men all saying that they're a Walter Mitty. And it turns out that the guy's some freaking war hero. This is literally, I'm picking something that happened the other day. I think we just need to start recognizing, having honest conversation. You know, some people in the veterans community, and I guess, you know, none of us are perfect or claim to be. Some are just downright nasty people. And that's because of their unhealed childhood trauma. And,
100%.
you know, and it gets passed off as banter or passed off as, oh, he was in the Falklands, just, you know, and it's like, no, he's an abusive fucker that just takes his shit out on everybody, has literally never got a nice thing to say about his, in our case, fellow Marines who and like I say, I'm not blaming the individual, highlighting that this needs to be a conversation. We need to be thinking about what we're putting online, how we talk to people.
But not just that, Chris, not just that, is that what you're describing is actually something overt. You can see it. You can see when somebody starts saying nasty things and then the thread gets nastier, and supposedly banter takes place and it goes backwards and forwards on the thread. That's overt. But take the example of my ex, as one. There's a lot of this that goes on as well, in the sense that as we get older and the ego starts to realize that we can become more aware of our own mortality, what you find through social media is a lot of people reconnect that maybe haven't spoken to each other for 30 years, and there are beautiful things to that people find somebody that they just lost contact with back in the days when you didn't have the cloud, and you just had an address book that you might have lost or whatever, and you lost contact. And so there are lots of positive sides to that. But this ex of mine, who really should have ended up in jail, there's no ifs or buts about it, and has absolutely no empathy, doesn't feel sorry, has no remorse whatsoever for what he did to me. And he's reconnected with the guys in his regiment, and they all think, oh, great guy and whatever, because they only know the side of him that they saw. So there's a covert side to these things as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And I actually had to point out to somebody who I know through, when I was with him many years ago, I actually had to point out to her and say to her, how can you be friends with somebody when you know what they've done? Why would you want to be? That's a bit like saying, well, I'm going to be friends with Jeffrey Epstein or whoever, somebody, or Peter Sutcliffe or whatever. I know what they've done, but they're all right to me. Why would you? What is it within you that makes you want to align with somebody like that? It's different when you just don't know, but people often, when they do know, they still, oh, well, that's the elephant in the room. We won't talk about it. So I agree with you. I think I have a massive respect, particularly for Falklands veterans, because I know what they were up against. I have a massive respect for everything that they achieved in that war. But that doesn't mean that everybody that's a veteran of there or anywhere else are all nice people. Some are, some aren't.
Absolutely. Yes. Mixed across the board. Jay, can we talk about your bodybuilding? Because that's I would say it's a passion that we shared, but it was certainly a passion for me back when I was quite heavily into it. And it was, what can I say? Obviously, for me, I'm talking me here, when I look back, it was an extension of me desperately trying to prove my self-worth, impress people, get some I always had self-esteem. Something was missing inside. And I remember I walked in a pub one day to go and meet my old man. And I'm in there, and it was a bit ridiculous. I think I had the biggest arms in the Royal Marines at the time, and yet I was 5'8". So the lads used to just crease up when I walked into our office. Because it was just so ridiculous, and I walked into the pub, and my dad looked at me, and he just turned to the person next to him and said, "Ugh, someone stick a pin in him, will they?" And I was like, "Dad, why are you not sharing my happiness at this, this abnormally, bizarrely, weirdly proportioned body that I've now got?" Why? And what it was is he was trying to say, "Son, you're perfect as you are. In fact, and turned to my stepmother who was stepmother at the time, and I said, look, why's Dad got this? There's never any communication in that generation. No one actually just says. So you're always in this state as a kid of confusion. Yeah. And my stepmother turned around. She said, Chris, you're the most handsome guy I know. And when you walk down the street, heads turn. I was like, sorry, did I just totally mishear what? No one had ever said anything like that. And friends at home, I'm not claiming to be the most handsome man on the world. What I'm saying is they were trying to tell me, you don't have to prove nothing to no one. You're perfectly fine as you are. But in their language, well, my stepmom was obviously very honest and open, but in my dad, he couldn't bring himself to say, he didn't know how to say that to me. So I'm out there thinking that I'm not this person, and that if I can get my muscles a bit more bigger, and talk about dysmorphia, I genuinely would go in the gym, and I started off, I had the old, the pokey pin thing on weight number 1. Then it wasn't long before I had it on the full stack. Then I used to get all the weights in the gym that I could fit on top of the stack. And then I used to ask them if they'd come and stand on it. Right? It's just like insane. And the bigger I got, I wouldn't say the smaller I felt, but I couldn't see it, Jay, And just one thing more about honesty. A mate of mine, Mick, come up to me and said, we're on a night out, and I had the proverbial tight, T-shirt on my 17.5-inch biceps. And he's like, Chris, look, everyone's kind of impressed with what you've done with your body, mate. Don't think we're not. He says, but this, like, just wear a fucking normal shirt, mate. What he was trying to say, he could see the desperateness in me of trying to get attention. I was a neglected child that still felt, I'd carried that into adulthood, and that's a short synopsis of my story. What was your bodybuilding experience like?
Can we pause? I'm just gonna. So my experience with bodybuilding, I don't think anything happens by accident, but I started weight training. So I moved, obviously I had to move after Gary died, because you lose your home. People forget that. When you're in army quarters, when your husband dies, you're no longer entitled to your home. So I moved back to where I'd lived before I got married. And a friend of mine said, oh, why don't you come to my club? And I said, well, what is your club? And she said, oh, well, it's like a health club. Come and have a look at it and see what you think. So I went and had a look. And so 1983, I started weight training. And I quite liked it. It was a balance, I'd always exercise. I used to be a dancer when I was younger. I'd done ballet, tap, all that kind of stuff. So I'd always exercised all my life, but I thought I quite liked this, doing weights. And then I got more serious during the relationship, the abusive relationship that I was in. And I think that was a definite outlet for my frustration, because there were so many mind games going on at the time. I didn't really understand until much later. And so that was a place I could take myself and do a couple of hours in the gym. And then one day there was a guy in there who he won the under 21s, I think, and he was competing. And he said to me, I was doing back that night, and he said to me, do a back double biceps. And I said to him, how do you do that? I haven't got any idea how to do a back double biceps. So he explained it, and I did the pose. And he just went, You know, he said, "Your back," he said, "you should compete." And I said, "Well, I can't see my back. What's it look like?" And he said, "Pretty amazing, you know." So I was like, "Oh, okay." So I did one sort of little competition, I think somewhere around 86, 88. Yeah, I can't remember. And then I got more and more into it after I got out of that relationship, and I moved to London and I started training. And then I started to actually compete in 1992. And that year, one of the judges said to me, I came second in the competition, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "You should go for the next qualifier in Derbyshire, wherever." He said, he said, "You only just came second. You could still qualify for the." And I said, "I'm not ready. I'm aiming for next year." So I kind of got more and more into it. And then how I got really into it seriously was that I would say, from all of the abuse that I've described to you, I had not anger inside of me, I had pure rage inside of me, which is very, very common, particularly with sexual abuse. You know, it's one of the most unfair things that you feel could ever happen to you. And so I discovered that the heavier I went, the better I looked, because obviously you get the benefits when you work out, as you've described. You know, your body changes quite dramatically. I am only 5'1", but I'm a typical bodybuilder shape. You know, I've got very broad shoulders for my height. You know, I've got that natural V. And so I started changing shape quite dramatically. And I discovered that the heavier I went, the more emotion I got out of me, that anger. It was a really positive outlet for all of that anger. And so here's the interesting thing. You're talking about the self-esteem thing, and I think there's always an element of that. If you're going to go into a sport that's all about looking perfect, there's always going to be a feeling of being less than somewhere in there. You know, I I will change my mind if I ever meet someone that doesn't have that. You know, but for me, I can honestly say that when I won the NABA Miss England in 1995, and I was probably, you know, that year I was at the peak of what I wanted to look like. I was 100%. This is what I want to look like. You know, I loved it. I had no self-esteem. I still had no self-esteem. And I give talks on it now, and I say, you know, the perfect body. And you know what you're saying about your bulging biceps? Because back in the 80s and 90s, there were hardly any women doing it back then. You could be two of you as women in a gym and 50 men. There was hardly any women doing it back
Oh,
in the
right,
80s,
yeah.
yeah, in the early 90s. But I was lucky that they brought in this new class called the fitness figure, because I was too muscular for the bikini and I wasn't muscular enough for the physique. And I certainly wasn't going to get ripped enough for the physique. Then they brought in this new class called the fitness figure, which was perfect for my shape. So I competed at absolutely the right time, you know, in terms of competition. But I still had no self-esteem. I would walk down the supermarket aisle and I see some woman nudging her husband, and they'd be, you know, looking at me because it was so unusual to see a woman with muscles back then. But I can honestly say, you know, and I was 38 when I peaked, still had no self-esteem.
Yeah,
And
it's a contradiction, though, isn't it? The bigger you get, the less esteem you. I was the same. I walked down the beach in Canada. I think it was Kelowna, on the shore of this beautiful lake.
uh,
And I'm walking down this lake, and I'm just wondering why people were looking at me. I'm being 100% honest here. I was thought, well, if I spilt my bloody food down my shirt or something, do you know what I mean? It's all self-conscious, and
there's the stain.
yeah, it was. Did you? I came out of it sort of naturally, probably just. I think I think I started to focus on business more. So go into the gym, I just kicked it into touch. It was as simple as that, really. But did you have any reason why you stopped?
Oh yeah. So in 1995, I did 4 competitions, and then I did my last competition in 1998. And that was, I qualified for the Tropicana finals. That was the semi-finals. But I hadn't, this injury was on me because I hadn't warmed up sufficiently. And when I went into the splits on stage, I felt my hamstring go.
Ooh.
Yeah. And, you know, adrenaline kind of kicks in. And I remember sort of putting my arms out into this pose and smiling at the audience and the judges and thinking, I have no idea how I'm going to get back up. You know, I had to finish my routine and everything. And the finals was 2 weeks away. So there was no way I was going to make the finals. And so I took a year off in 1999. And then I just started training in January of 2000 to compete that year. And in February of that year, I had a head-on car crash on the North Circular because a guy lost control of his car, spun, and ends up coming at me the wrong way, going the wrong. It's a bit like North Circular, if you know it, in certain parts, and this particular part, 5 lanes wide. You've got the M11, you've got all these roads merging into one, 50-mile-an-hour limit. He lost control. He's coming at me, coming the wrong way down what is in effect a motorway. I ended up getting cut out of the car by the fire brigade because I had a back injury in the thing. And long story short, after I don't know how long of having problems and whatever, I was basically told by an orthopedic surgeon to forget about bodybuilding. I had spinal injuries. One side of that, I went through the whole 5 years. And here's where repeat patterns, you know, law of attraction, repeat patterns. My pattern was not being heard, not being listened to. You know, 5 years, they're treating me like I'm some kind of hypochondriac. And the reality is, I've always been fit and I loved bodybuilding. Why would I not want to do it? But it was, we can't find anything wrong with you, until I had the MRI. And then the question was, what are you doing for your pain? And me being typically me, I said, well, the pain you've been telling me for 5 years I don't have. And then, you know, the extent of what was wrong with me comes out. So it took me a long time to get back into doing some decent training. And I still today train more than most 25-year-olds do. But I have, you know, I am not just a qualified PT, I'm a qualified clinical PT. I've got a lot of knowledge in my head. And I always thought I would find a way back to training one day. And I remember having this conversation with this barrister, and he said to me, he said, well, you know, is it fair to say, because obviously they're doing the claim for the accident, is it fair to say that you'll never, you know, bodybuild again? And I said, I can't say that. And they're looking at me like I'm mad because they've seen the scan results and the reports and all the rest of it. And I said, look, I may not compete again, but bodybuilding is about the training. You know, if you're asking me, can I stand up in a court of law and say, I'll never do this again? I'm not prepared to take my head to such a negative space. And they're still looking at me like I'm mad. And here I am. And this happened in 2000. So this was many, many years ago. And here I am all these years later. And I'm in the gym, as I say, training more than most 25-year-olds. Here's the difference. And I think you've said it in a way. I think there's something very punitive about bodybuilding, to the extremes that you go to with both diet and the level of exercise that you will push yourself to, that many people who compete wouldn't admit to. And then on top of that, you've got the psychological factor that you're not in anything like Usain Bolt doing 100 meters, and it's a clear thing. Whoever wins is the first past the finish line. You're in a sport whereby you're getting judged, and somebody else's opinion decides on whether you win that trophy or not. Yeah. So I think psychologically it can be quite punitive, and physically it certainly can be, especially with some of the extremes of the diets. That's kind of why, with it, having a history of eating disorders, I was never going to go to international level, and I was never going to do really well. I could have built the size for the physique classes, but I was never going to get my body fat that low to be able to do well in them, because it's really extreme. And then the question is, as you get older, you know, and you balance out, and I certainly have got plenty of self-esteem now, why do you want to do that to yourself?
Yeah. I was in the gym this morning, and I think I must be the only person in there that I do squats and I don't put any weights on the bar. Don't really need to. I mean, in my kickboxing class, we do squats. We don't do squats with weights. We just do like these kind of, I don't know, they're like Buddha squats.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
I'll tell you what, you do 20 of them, blooming hell, you get your quads start burning. And so when I'm
Yeah.
in the gym, I just sort of do it for a bit of form and a bit of stretching, and I take great delight in using the lightest weights in there, and now I put the peg on the easy, not the ridiculously small one, but the one that's just, it's just enough. And yeah, it's kind of funny now because I'm 55, but I've still got the body I had when I was 19. I haven't gone to that like dad body thing yet. I haven't.
Mm.
The only time I've start to notice my age is when either when I look at my face, tells a thousand tales, or I notice when I get dehydrated in the summer, then I start to see my skin starting to shrivel, like, in a way that I never noticed when I was younger. But yeah, it's kind of like it's good for me going to the gym because I've got a good deal going on here. Don't ask me why, but
Mm.
yeah. But then I've eaten mainly vegetables for the last 25 years, and
Okay.
I say to anyone, keep your body pH level what it's supposed to be, folks, because it's all right living on buckets of coffee and huge steaks and alcohol and all that, but it doesn't have to take a toll on your body, I think, because you're pumping yourself full of acid, and um, it's yeah, I enjoy it. I like it.
Do you also find, because I think this is what's so important, and it's why I try and encourage women. It's not an age thing, although I love it when I see older women exercise, because I think too many of them don't. That it's not just the way it affects how you look, and it obviously keeps you trimmer, and it's much healthier for your bones and all of the other things, and your mobility, because as you get older, and now I'm kind of headed towards 70, it is that thing where I'm looking at people and I'm thinking, whoa, like how you could be if you didn't keep active, is that with the chemical changes that you get with the catecholamines and the endorphins and the things that you get from exercise, that it is such a good balancer with mental health.
Yes, it's again, it's another sort of paradox because it can, like, if I don't work out in the morning, I don't like these. If I don't go for a walk around the block, or a jog, or gym, or go and swim a few lanes, and it is I only swim a few lanes, but if I don't do that, and certainly if I don't have my sauna, I've got a sauna that I built, then my day is very different. It's sluggish, I'm lethargic, I've got little interest. And the conundrum there is that, wow, maybe you're relying a bit too much on the exercise for, I mean, yes, it is. What do they call it? In gaming, they call it a cheat, wouldn't they? It's a cheap way to get sort of happy. Those days when you can't do it, you've also got to find a way. You've always got to find your way into the light. And you talk about an eating disorder, but I think I would be classed now as having an eating disorder. I love to eat. When you've given up alcohol, drugs, smoking, sugar, as much as you can, carbohydrates as much as you can, meat, yada yada yada, caffeine. There isn't a lot more you can rely on to self-medicate your childhood trauma. And food obviously become, what I'm trying to say is I've still got work to do on myself. I know that. I think I'm probably my own worst enemy because I don't meditate enough. And I do believe that it's in that silence is where, like, for example, when you go and have that dessert, when you know you don't need it, if you were to say, no, I'm going to go and walk around the block now and just have a think to myself, reflect, let some God into my life, I bet you'd come home and go, no, I don't need that dessert, do I? Do you know? But it's because we don't do that. We don't do that. We instantly go to the slave to our emotion.
I think that is so true, Chris. I think that is so true. And one of the things that, I see over and over and again, sadly more so with men now, but it's always been historically a women's problem, but it's happening with men now, that if you look at things from a holistic perspective, you've got the third chakra, the solar plexus, which is the center of self. So that's self-worth, self-esteem, self-everything. When we ram food down our mouths to the point where we're full up and beyond, what we're actually doing on a holistic level is squashing down our emotions. And so, I can't say that it's great when you get triggered, because, we all know that it's a pretty shitty place to be when it's going on. But these days, when something does trigger me, I'm very welcoming of it, because it's another opportunity for healing. Anything that triggers you is something that's yet to be healed. And I'll keep food here for a minute, but I'll just quickly go back to what that doctor said to me in 2019. I don't think you're coming back from it this time. I couldn't have been more devastated at the idea that I was going to be feeling like that for the rest of my life, because that would have been a case of, I need to check out. Life is just not going to be worth living if I'm going to be this triggered forever, And so I did loads more therapy, and that's when I wrote my first book in 2019, and writing became my salvation. When I there were days when I wouldn't go outside the house for 3 days. That's how bad the PTSD was at that point. But slowly, very, very slowly, through writing and healing and doing more therapy and doing more work, it wasn't about wanting to prove the doctor wrong. It was about, if I can't improve this, I don't want to be here. So that was the incentive in that space. And then on the other hand, when we go back to the food thing, I so wish that we had more knowledge and understanding out there in the world. It's all right you having it, it's all right me having it, it's all right a few people having it, but more honest conversations about how people are literally eating themselves to death these days, you know, because the actual, nobody needs to have a weight problem apart from in rare circumstances when there is something really wrong with the body. And you know, when I used to work and in a gym, and women used to come in and say, "Oh, it's all right for you." I said, "What's all right for me?" "Oh, well, you're nice and slim." "Well, I'm not like this by accident." You know, and it's not for what I eat. And then I'd very politely say to them, "Well, if it's genuinely not for what you eat, then you must go and see your GP in case you've got a thyroid issue or something else going on. Because if it's not what you're putting in your mouth, you have to check this out medically." And it's amazing how quickly that conversation would turn into, "Oh, well, maybe I eat more than I realise." Because they know, everybody knows. You know, you're saying quite openly, which is beautiful to see, "Oh, I know I've still got work to do." Well, the reality is, as long as we're alive, we're all going to, the minute we think we know it all, we know nothing.
Yes, and
Yeah.
of course, putting on weight can also be alcohol, can't it? Which some people are hesitant to admit.
Yeah. It's all, at the end of the day, it's basic maths. And people may not like hearing this, but if it's kind of almost irrelevant, although some things are more unhealthy than others. But if more calories are going in than are being used up, you're going to expand. And I know that Katie Hopkins did a program she was very, very unpopular for, you know, where she deliberately put on something like 6 stone by God. I mean, I would have hated to have done that. No matter how much they paid me, I wouldn't have wanted to do that. She put on something like 6 stone, and then she just went back to eating what she would normally eat and then lost it all again. And for most people, whether they want to hear that or not, whether they're male or female, that's the reality. It's a numbers game, it's basic maths.
Yeah.
It's just that if you are eating lots of sugar, you're going to have lots of inflammation. If you're drinking alcohol, that's empty calories. You know, that there will be, but even if you're eating too much of really healthy foods, if it's too many calories, you're still going to put on weight.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we live quite sedentary lives, don't we?
We're encouraged to.
Yeah.
With all the distractions that we have now, with video games. And I saw a guy, I was on the bike in the gym the other night, and I saw a guy, and it made me really feel sad. He was not that old. I would have said he was probably in his early 30s maximum. And he literally had a massive belly. You know, he wasn't huge everywhere else, but he had this massive, he was overweight, massive belly, but the kind of shape that you know medically is really unhealthy. And he was lying on the leg press on his phone. And 5 minutes went by and he was still lying on the leg press. I mean, if the gym had been busier, somebody would have said, "Listen, mate, can I can I use it?" But he was just lying there on his phone, tapping away. And I was just mesmerized almost by watching, because I was just, you know, doing my cycling, thinking, is he ever going to do a set? And eventually he did a set, and then another 5 minutes went by.
Yeah, in my gym, as you come in through the, where you scan your code,
Mm-hmm.
they got a row of cattle prods. So you just pick up a cattle prod, and as you go around the machines, if someone's not doing it fast enough, you just give them a bit of an electric shock.
Oh, really?
I wish.
I'm
Oh, I tell you
going
what,
to tell you. I'm going to
just
tell you something funny. I'm going to tell you something funny that happened a couple of weeks ago. We got 2 leg presses in the gym I use, and one of them was broken for a while. And it was one of these things that, you know, it was a big job to fix it. Okay, and so for quite a long time we only had the one leg press, so you know, you're usually going to have to wait for it. And there was these 2 young guys on there, and they were again on their phones and chatting away in between sets and all the rest of it. And I said to him, how many more sets have you got? Oh, we've got 2 each. Okay, off I went. I went and did another exercise. I came back. Have you nearly finished? Long story short, he looks at me and said, I said, listen, you're starting to take the pee now. You know, there are other people in the gym. There's only one leg press. And he looks at me and said, if you knew anything about bodybuilding. And I just went, if I knew anything about bodybuilding. Like, really? He said, you would know that you need to rest at least 2 to 3 minutes between sets. And I'm in my head, I'm thinking, mate, you're not using enough weight to need to rest 2 to 3 minutes between sets, you know?
It's not just that, it's just get off the machine and stand by it, and then if someone wants to hop on and do their set, they can do it, then they can hop off, and you it's hard not to let it irritate you. That sat on just scrolling through the phone.
But you see, here's the thing. This is where we are, again, as a race, and I'm talking about the human race, very judgmental. Because he would never have said that to me back when I was competing. He's saying that to me because even though I don't look unfit, I don't have that competition body anymore. And I'm older, and there is quite a lot of disrespect that older women get in general. And so there's an attitude there. Whereas in actual fact, if he'd had a different conversation with me, I have a wealth of knowledge that he could have tapped into.
Mm.
So if you look at it, so many things in life are how we view them, aren't they?
I only do one set these days, so I'm a good bet. Get on the machine behind me. You watch me do my set, and because I just, you know, you make the weights work for you, don't you? You don't have to do 3 sets. You can do 1 set and really stretch out your pecs, and then, you know, a bit of this, and then really, and that's it. I haven't got time to be in the gym for 3 sets. And you don't need to. Like I said, I've still got the same body I've had when I'm 19. I do 1 set. And I also rode across the Atlantic in January. And ran across the Sahara Desert the year before. So it's not, you know, you're not losing anything, folks, by doing 1 set.
Well, you may or may not be aware of this, but when I went to the Falklands, you probably don't know actually. When I went to the Falklands,
Jay, can you speak up? I don't know, your audio's dropping out a bit.
Okay. When I went to the Falklands in 2017, I actually tabbed my husband's last footsteps. So last photos I have of him are on Sussex Mountain. And I tabbed from Sussex Mountain down through where they had the battle, and then I went beyond into Goose Green to the memorial, you know, which is obviously the bit that he didn't. And that was, according to the recovery driver, just over 20 miles, which was after I had all those health issues.
Oh,
so
wow.
I was pretty chuffed at that because, and you know, I was talking to a lot of the guys before I went, and they kept saying to me, oh, Jay, it's very unforgiving terrain. And I kept saying, please don't say that. I haven't been yet. And it is very unforgiving terrain. So I did that tab, which is over it's not flat ground. There's nowhere to hide unless you were dug in. But they got these things that they call diddly dee, these big plants that are like, they call them babies' heads because that's how big they are. It's very uneven flat ground. And then another tab I did another day was from Fursbush Pass to up over Mount Longdon, Wireless Ridge, and then into Stanley. So that was about 13 miles. So that was after I'd had, you know, I'd literally nearly checked out twice in a year. So I'm a great believer. And actually, when I had the heart thing, this is something that I think is so relevant, so important to why fitness is so important in all of our lives, is that after the heart episode, the first thing the consultant said that day was, you're going to have heart muscle damage, because I had very high levels of an enzyme in my blood, which is the thing they test whether you've had a heart attack or not. And my levels, I'll never forget that number, 8,917. Well, if you get to 10,000, your heart's pretty much destroyed. And my heart made a full recovery, and nobody can explain why, because it shouldn't have happened. And the only thing that I think is a possibility, unless of course it was a higher power intervening, which is perfectly possible in my world, is that I've been fit all my life.
Yeah.
And so you have a natural resilience and recovery from that.
Yeah, it was like, I worked in Mozambique once, and everybody got malaria, and except me. Although when we went to the doctor, they do this blood test thing. They prick your finger, put it under the microscope, and then they rate you on what malaria you've got out of 5 stars. So a heavy bout is 5 stars, obviously. And I had a star. I don't know if I had malaria or not, but what I noticed, we had a chap called Tony with us. I doubt he's still with us now, because he wasn't in the best of health back then. He was a big drinker, big smoker, and when he got it, oh my God, it knocked him for 6. It really, really battered him. He thought he was going to die. So he had that extreme, and I had apparently I've got it, but I didn't feel anything. So I wonder if that was to do with fitness.
I think there's always going to be an element of that. I mean, some of us are. One of the things I studied during my 10 years of studying in my 40s was Ayurveda. And one of the things you learn about the doshas, which is the different parts of the life force energy you've got, that I'm what they call tridoshic. So I have each. Normally you have 2, but I have the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and I'm a combination. And the tridoshic people have got the strongest constitutions. So I think sometimes there is an element that some of us are more naturally resilient than others. I certainly don't think if I didn't have those elements in my genetic makeup that I would still be here, because there's too many things that could have taken me out along the way. But it's how much you recover. And certainly I think in episodes like that heart thing, that no doctor can explain it in terms medically. They can't explain why my heart made that recovery. So for sure, I think fitness is, but I said to them at the time, I said to the doctor in the hospital, how long before I can go to the gym? And he looked at me and said, give it 4 weeks. So 4 weeks to the day, I rocked up at the gym, still wasn't back to normal. So I had to use the lift. And I went in the gym, and the manager there has known me for years. And he said to me, are you sure? And I said, yes. And I went in and I picked up the smallest dumbbells, did 5-6 sets of bicep curls, and went home. Because it was mentally going and doing something.
Yeah.
And then within like a month, I was doing I think I did a 5-miler. And then, but I built it up. You've got to do graded exercise. You'd be stupid to think you can go in and just go back to what you were doing before. But I built it up, and within a very short space of time. So when I did the tabs in the Falklands, it was actually only a couple of years down the road from that. And, there's been times when I didn't think my health was going to get much better than it was, and it continues to surprise me.
Good.
So,
what about, Jay, sorry, we're talking about physical health, but you mentioned the chakras earlier. What's your spiritual take? Is that a road you've gone full on down? Like I would say I've sort of thrown myself into the energy, vibration and frequency field simply because it explains all those answers that obviously all my life I was looking for through, bodybuilding, through drugs, through, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And if I can just add one thing to that. They talk about Kundalini and this energy that's supposed to come for 3 days every month when the moon's in your star sign. I know that probably sounds a bit fanciful and a bit kind of woo-woo, I think is the expression to some. But no, I can totally get that when you think that we're electromagnetic beings and the moon is a magnetic force and the sun is an electric force. You can see there's a bigger thing going on here, right? But for me, it's quite simple. I developed this really nice buzz in my body when I've laid off all the shit, So, for example, when I used to go partying, I probably will party again, but I haven't done that for 6 months now since we celebrated rowing the Atlantic. Celebrate's just a euphemism for an excuse to drink loads of alcohol and but undoubtedly when you're living that life, oh man, you never have this beautiful feeling that I have now. You just don't have it. It kills it. You physically cannot develop it. But when you're off and when you've been, talk about alkaline diet quite a lot on my channel simply because it's the key to everything. The key to perfect health and never getting ill is this is what did it for me, And when I'm doing, when my body's, got a good pH 7.25, when I'm not hungover, when I'm not overeating, and I physically develop like this electromagnetic field, like this I can't think of the name of it, and I get my body just rushes like I've taken ecstasy or something. And so I would just say, just from that point of view, I think I'm doing, I know that I'm doing something right. When it gets to this massive Kundalini awakening that they call, I can't say I've ever had to like hold myself down in my chair because I personally haven't experienced that. And so I just want to get your thoughts on it all, Jay, and what it's meant to you. And
well, for me, I went on a journey in my 40s, and I talk about it in my bio in the sense that I realized that one of the reasons why I did so badly at school was because I wasn't studying things that I enjoyed. Yeah. And of course, ADHD, your biggest enemy is boredom. So in my 40s, I went on this journey, and I actually just originally went out to qualify as a life coach because everybody kept telling me, oh, you'd be a great life coach. And that was the thing of the time. And then once I passed that diploma, I started looking at all these other things and thinking, oh, now I'm interested in this. And so this big holistic door opened up for me, and I became a Reiki master, and I went back to college for 2 years and retrained. I trained in massage in the 80s, but I retrained in massage, did 2 years at college, studied Ayurveda, kept studying and studying and studying, because all that time I was looking for answers as to how I could heal myself. And I kept finding more and more answers. Now, put very simply, everything is energy. And energy can change form. So we can die, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, and all of that. But the essence will go off somewhere else.
Yes.
Energy is energy. And what I learned was that everything, if you study enough, everything joins up. And all of this knowledge has been out there for thousands. And Ayurveda is thousands of years old. And it works on the basis of trying to keep you healthy rather than treat you when you get sick. And how I put it is that dis-ease turns into disease. So I know, and simply put, somebody said to me, very brutal and very blunt, but also true, when my bowel burst, this woman said to me, she said, clever girl, she said, people have been pouring poison into you for years and you threw it all out in one go. Now, very true, but if I actually sat down and thought about the choice of how I'd like to do that, that probably wouldn't have been. I always say those two episodes that happened cleared out my heart chakra, and it cleared out, my second chakra, which interestingly is the center, the sacral chakra. That is the center of where sexual abuse takes place. Yeah. So the disease manifested in these areas where there was trauma and there was pain. I can think of a lot better ways to deal with it than something quite so drastic. But when I was working in palliative care, I never met one patient that hadn't manifested cancer in the area of their body where they were carrying, which would relate to the trauma they were carrying that they'd never dealt with. It wasn't 50, 60, 70%. It was 100%. Now, 34 years ago, when I first started working there, at that time, if I'd have said to my boss, I'd like to do some research around this, I would have been looked at as if I was a nut job, because we've come on. So we have all this ancient knowledge that, from my perception of what I see, and the more I've studied and the more I see now, we have people like Dr. Bruce Lipton. If you haven't looked at his work, I would strongly recommend it. He's known as the father of epigenetics. So we now know that it's not whether you've got the gene for cancer that decides whether you've got or you're going to get cancer or not. It's the environment that turns it on or turns it off.
Yeah.
We have got Dr. Gabor Mate. We have got so many greats of our time that Deepak Chopra is another one, endocrinologist, Ayurvedic doctor, that there's so much knowledge of ancient knowledge that's coming back into the mainstream now and accessible, free for anybody and everybody, because there's so much out there on YouTube and other channels, that you can tap into. So yeah, I mean, which is what brings me back to that same thing that I say. If anything ever triggers me now, I'm grateful for it, because it shows me where I've yet to heal. And when things that would have triggered me don't, I know that, that part of me has healed. So energetically, the mind can cause disease just as easily as the food we eat and the water we drink and anything else that we do, whether we exercise or whether we don't. If we don't operate a holistic approach and we neglect one part of mind, body, and spirit, that can still bring about some kind of disaster. Make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think we all come to the same conclusions, don't we, when we look at this long enough? What practices do you invoke then on a daily basis to keep your spiritual health tip top?
Every single morning when I wake up, I have a breathing app on my phone. So every single morning I do that. I do breath work. And I try and do breath work as well if there's any triggers going on, or if I'm in any kind of situations that I need to ground myself. I'll always come back to breath work. I have recently started trying whenever I can to go out, and there's a local park near me. I'll do a quick half an hour. I put a timer on the phone, do a half an hour walk, and then I've got my gym, all the rest of it. I eat. I mean, yesterday was my birthday, so I had a bit of banoffee pie and some wine, and I enjoyed it. But that's not how I live every day. I eat reasonably healthy and have a bit of naughtiness. I've drastically cut down sugar in my diet, and all the things you're talking about, the things that create inflammation in the body. and caffeine and all of those things. I'm lucky that for me, my addictions always came out either as workaholism, which you can always make an excuse to work because you've got to earn money to pay the bills, yeah, or in eating, so I'm really lucky that drugs never did it for me. So I didn't go down the path that you went down. I think we all have our own journeys in our own way. And so if you're doing anything too much, then you're coming away from health and you're coming away from balance. So what I do these days is I try and balance out work, which I do a lot less of. I choose what I do these days. I've got nothing to prove. I've got nothing I need to go out there in the world and prove and do. I share my story because I know it gives hope and inspiration to others. And I'm known now as an expert with grief and resilience. Great. If you can, by telling your story, give hope to others, that's what your podcast is all about, isn't it? But I carry on studying, and I think that's a great part of the mind part of mind, body, and spirit. And recently I've been watching, there's a fantastic neuroscientist called Dr. Tara Schwartz, and I've been watching her stuff. And I know you did a podcast with Tam Thornborough, looking at rewiring and the highways. And so in my journey, as I said to you earlier, the hardest bit has been trying to rewire that hard drive. It's been a bit like looking for the virus in the hard drive of the computer without the software to find it. Yeah. So what I've learned to do is I've learned to listen somatically to what's going on in my body. That's something I do a check-in several times a day. How tense are my muscles? What am I thinking? How am I feeling? And check in those things so that, for example, breath work brings you looking at those things to ground yourself and to give yourself nurturing. Because isn't that what we've been talking about childhoods, where I think the one thing you and I have definitely got in common is that word neglect. And if you look at the way most adults these days supposedly take care of themselves, there's a heck of a lot of neglect that goes on.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny when you put it like that. We neglect ourselves, don't we? And
Yeah.
we think that treating ourselves with this, that, and that is acceptable, but really, when you look at these behaviours, you're putting yourself in an earlier grave, aren't you?
Yeah. And when you look at, and this is the bit that I think the thing that somebody said to me, I did a podcast a couple of weeks back. It's not out yet, but I did it with a psychologist. So she's a lovely lady, and she asked me. She said to me, she said, "You come across as a very kind person. Like despite all the trauma you've had, you come across as really kind." Words to that effect. And I said, yeah, and that out of everything that I've achieved in my life, that's what I'm the most proudest of, is that everything that's happened to me doesn't define who I am today. And empaths are kind by nature, everything that I've done I'm always happy when I'm helping people, counseling in palliative care, being a therapist, being a holistic therapist. I'm always happy when I'm helping people. That's an empath's nature. But here's where empaths go very, very wrong. And they have to learn this lesson often the hard way is they put other people before themselves. And we have to learn to take care of ourselves, because when you're on that aeroplane, what do they say to you? You put your oxygen mask on first before you put it on the child next to you. Because if you're not okay, you can only take care of for other people to a certain extent, and then you're absolutely depleted. So we have to learn, and I've seen this as a pattern through specifically children who've been abused or neglected, is that you see a child or you see an adult that's taking good care of themselves, they haven't gone through that kind of abuse, because you have to learn it if it's not something that was put into your natural programming.
Absolutely. Yes, we've all had quite a lot to learn, haven't we? Yeah.
And I think, you know, the beauty of life is every single day I'm on this planet, and there's a lot less time ahead of me than there is behind me now. Every single day I learn something new. And I remember my grampy, who was he was my step grampy, and I wish I'd actually spent more time with him. If I'd gone to live with him, my life would have been very different. He died when he was 91. And he used to always have this attitude of his life was lived by everything in moderation. You know, so he drank and smoked all his life. He smoked a pipe, and he drank pretty much every day, but it would be a glass of sherry or a G&T. And he would fill up his pipe in the morning, and he'd take a few puffs, and then he'd put it out, and that pipe lasted him all day. And all of it was all about, his whole life was about being open to learning, being open to new information. If there's anything I could change about my life to have eased my journey, I would have begged him for me to go and live with him when I was quite young. And I think things would have been very different. But then maybe I wouldn't have as much to offer people by way of my experiences and sharing those now. You know, it's comme ci, comme ça, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, you know, hindsight's not just a wonderful thing, but it's also subjective. And, you know, I mean, that it's just it, isn't it? If we changed anything about our past, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. We'd be on a
No.
completely different trajectory. I can't even say that word. But yes.
Yeah. And I think, you know, this last, what I've been learning, and I think, again, we knowledge is just growing. I've got to put, as we're coming to the end here, I've got to put this into the conversation, because you asked me and I haven't answered that question about my thoughts on ADHD. So if you listen to neuroscientists and neurosurgeons, they actually come to the same conclusion, the majority of them, that actually it's either genetic, but that also comes into the fact that with people like Dr. Gabor Mate, what they will also say is there's intergenerational trauma. So that's part of that genetics. And if you get trauma when the brain is actually developing, which is later in men, you know, it could be anything up to 24 and usually 21 in women, yeah, then you can have a problem with your wiring somewhere. That's what happens. Or, as one guy says, if I can't see it in the family genetics, it will be from a head injury. So there is general consensus that these are the main causes of what causes ADHD in people. But what I think is absolutely fantastic, and I'm seeing absolute proof of it now, is what Tara Schwartz says and what other neuroscientists say about the whole rewiring of the brain, is that although our neuroplasticity gets less as we get older, just as we can't build muscle as easily and we're going to naturally, you know, carry more fat, blah, 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 and our hair is going to go grey, and nobody actually has got a cure for aging, you know, the neuroplasticity is still there, and you can still continue, if you do the right things, to rewire your brain. Equally, as you can continue to keep the same trauma and the same symptoms if you do nothing to rewire it. So I'm a great believer in that nothing is hopeless, not while you've got breath.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep on trucking, as Matthew Pritchard would say. Jay, would love to chat longer.
It's been great, Chris.
Yeah, so we'll have to have another chat on another day. We're going to put all your links below the podcast, so don't worry about that. Links to all your books. Friends at home, massive thank you. Firstly to Jay for joining us, and secondly to you for watching or listening. If you could like and subscribe, that would be absolutely awesome. Jay, did you have anything to add before I say a final goodbye to our audience?
No, apart from thanks for having me, Chris. I think these conversations on these podcasts are so important, and there are so many people out there that are becoming more and more conscious as the days go by, and that's beautiful to see.
Yes, very well said. Well said. Jay, stay on the line just so I can thank you properly after I click record button off. But yes, friends, if you can like and subscribe, that would be brilliant. Massive thank you to everyone that supports us on Locals or Patreon or becomes a YouTube member, all for as little as $1.99 a month. And thank you to everyone that came to our monthly Zoom meeting last night where we put the worlds to right. And the last thing I just want to say is thank you to everyone that's chipped in a $5 towards my upcoming Everest Summit, which I want to raise awareness of the link between unhealed, undiagnosed childhood trauma and veteran suicide. So thank you for that. There's a link below. Much love, everyone.